Danielle. Danielle.
Hi there.
Hi, sorry, I'll go back to my spot. Are you ready to start your presentation?
I am indeed. Would you like to have the slides going locally, or do you want me to share the screen?
It's easier for you to share the screen if that works.
Yeah, no problem. Give me 1 second.
So Danielle is talking to us about exploring next generation touch-rich interactions. It should be very interesting.
If I can get my screen share to work. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Lovely.
It's not a full screen though, it's quite small. Unless that's the way your screen set up. Got a black background.
Give me 1 moment. Sorry, let me just see if I can fix it.
Did everybody see it? I mean, it's a bit small. It's a bit small, but we can still see it if that's because it's not a very big room.
Sorry, I think I can fix it if you give me just 1 moment. I've just got a setting that's wrong here.
I think it'd be okay.
Okay, let's see if I can make it a bit bigger there. Not sure what's going on with it.
We can all move forward.
Sorry about that. Okay, let me try again here. So, is that better?
Yeah, that's better. That's fine. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thanks. And yeah, sorry about that. So good morning to everyone who's there. It's lovely to be speaking with you if virtually today. So I'm Danielle Barrios-O'Neill. As you said, thanks for the intro, Sarah. I'm the head of information experience design at the RCA, at the Royal College of Art, sorry, and my colleague Yoshi, who's also in the room, is the co-author for the sort of piece of research that I'll be talking about. And Yoshi is at Falmouth, and her research focuses on speculative design, especially design fiction, and its relationship to well-being. So the focus of the paper and the kind of research surrounding it has been around something that we describe as touch richness. And this is a term that we coined in order to describe a kind of set of characteristics that link touch with well-being. So what we're doing is essentially sort of critically examining the touch screen or the smart screen, which are terms that tend to kind of go together these days, as a lived technology. And we argue that next generation devices, or sort of looking ahead to interface design, both hardware and software, should take advantage of more touch-rich interactions. And I'll talk about what that means. As you can kind of see on the slide there, I've just kind of given a brief overview of what we talk about when we talk about kind of current design conventions, basically. So what's become ubiquitous and very normal because of firms like Apple. We've got these interfaces that are closer and closer to this kind of invisible and embedded interface. So the more invisible and kind of imperceptible the actual interface itself becomes, that's kind of become this design ideal. And as always happens, sort of as that becomes more widespread, more people adopt the devices that kind of use this kind of interface, that makes it easier and cheaper to develop the technology. It becomes cheaper to, so it's a kind of ongoing cycle of becoming increasingly popular and affordable. And that also means that touch screens and smart screens and different combinations of that sort of can almost now be hosted on any surface. And so obviously we're surrounded by that all the time. Not surprisingly, smart surfaces are, as we all know, they're kind of prime real estate for advertisers and content producers. So the now extremely sort of standard like newsfeed style app with the endless scrolling, the endless sort of refresh capability, it makes these interfaces and the apps that the devices are hosting, like TikTok or Twitter or whatever, it makes these spaces extremely sticky, or what's described as sticky, which basically is that people are obviously staying on them for a long time. And this is excellent news for the companies that wish to keep consumers online for longer periods of time. And this works sort of hand in hand with quote unquote sticky algorithms that are used for companies like TikTok that are generated using AI. So you end up with a situation in which the time spent on screen devices, and particularly smart touchscreen devices, is seemingly always increasing. And it's partly due to the actual design of the interface and what it makes possible. This is happening across a period of time that's kind of coterminous with the rising popularity of sort of certain kinds of devices. One technology enables the other kind of thing. And this is obviously extremely lucrative for technology firms. So perhaps not surprisingly, are you still able to see the slides okay? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so not surprisingly, I think so much time spent staring at and interacting with touchscreens has negative effects on the well-being of consumers. So we kind of all sort of know this, but we know that, sorry, just to be really clear, when I'm using the term well-being, or when we talk about well-being in the paper, what we're talking about is good health, basically good physical health, good mental health. This is the essentially like really broad brush sort of well-being definition. And there's a widening sort of range of research suggesting that touchscreen features have detrimental effects on well-being, so both physical and mental. And I'm sort of focusing on mental here, as you can see, mental health stuff. But these effects are linked to, for example, sort of compulsive engagement behaviors that have really similar qualities to addiction. So when you're using screens in a way that you get this kind, I mean, put really simply, you get this sort of dopamine hit from certain kinds of interaction. And when that's happening in this ongoing, uninterrupted way, as can happen with this kind of frictionless, embedded, like you don't even realize it's there kind of interface, it can have similar effects on your body and mind as other forms of addiction. So we have certain kind of anxiety and depressive symptoms and things like that. More time in like noisy smart screen environments is also shown to have a negative impact on users' cognition. So where there are sort of direct relationships between the time spent and like the time that you actually spend on the device, and then diminished attention span, kind of delayed social skill development, things like this. It's clear that our relationships with our devices are prevalent, and they're intense and highly consequential for well-being. And that's kind of irrespective of digital divide issues and things like this. So I'm sort of putting that slightly to the side and just talking about a sort of broad, making some broad generalizations around that. But part of this is about the seamless, kind of endless, integrated, almost invisible nature of the touchscreen, which from a design perspective, it's incredibly exciting. And coming from a design background, I remember when iPads came out, actually, specifically iPads, there was this sort of moment of going, oh, we don't really even know what it's going to be best at. Like it was this kind of open space that was great for developers and designers. It was really exciting. But from a well-being perspective, this kind of open space quality is potentially also its most kind of unhelpful attribute in terms of how that space gets populated. So this particular kind of interface, to come back to the kind of focus of the paper, so that's all sort of context, but this particular kind of interface is what Yoshi and I would describe as touch poor. So it's without any form of textural kind of richness or sense-based legibility. In terms of haptic input or the information that you're getting through the haptic sense, it's very poor in information. And that has an effect on well-being because we have a kind of natural need for touch. And we are sort of, from a kind of almost evolutionary perspective, we've developed specifically to understand the world through that sense. And so when we're constantly interacting with something which doesn't really stimulate that sense in normal ways, that ultimately has sort of negative effects. Especially with overuse, the kind of endless interaction thing that happens often with touchscreen devices is sort of like, if you think about the way the interface actually works with your sense of touch, it's kind of like the sort of haptic equivalent of staring at a blank wall for like hours. There's no input really for this incredibly important sense, or like really minimal input for this incredibly important sort of haptic sense. And informational touch, as I said, is shown to be extremely important for well-being. And you can see some of the research around that, just a quick gloss on that on the slide. But hands and particularly fingers have this extremely dense presence of nerve endings, which makes them a really rich source of tactile information. And we're gathering information in this way even sort of before birth. And so we understand this often, like there's loads of research around how this works in relation to like consumer marketing and like consumer behavior, because what people touch, they're more likely to buy, for example, or certain kinds of touch lead to conversion of customers in certain contexts. So it certainly influences decision-making. Touching, there are other things, you know, touching other humans reduces stress and produces feelings of pleasure. And it's shown to increase, sort of certain kinds of touch increase mindfulness. But all of these forms of touch are based on certain kinds of touch, which I'll get into in a moment here. And it isn't the kind of touch which basically is just of a blank glass screen with sort of no features. So one of the things that Yoshi and I have been working on is this idea of touch richness. So this is this is touch richness. TR here stands for touch richness. It's a design strategy, which basically is saying that the type, scale, and material involved with haptic kind of input and interfaces is incredibly important to sensory processing and sense fulfillment, which is necessary for well-being. So that we need to, so the idea is, we know this is good for us. We need to build this into interface design in ways that might help us sort of correct some of the things that are going wrong with interface design over the last couple of decades. This is based on the view that, first of all, that touch is important informationally, and that as sort of part of our information processing hardware, and that touch-rich experiences contribute to well-being. So that's kind of what that's built on. So we have, sorry, I seem to have missed, no, I did show that slide. This is a sort of general definition that we've described. And I think this is sort of something that we're refining as well as we go. But touch richness describes interface design that's rich in haptic information. And we've given it 4 dimensions of richness. So those are texture, elasticity, gesturality, and interpolation. And I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly because I've only got sort of a few minutes here. So texturality is the degree to which touch experiences are diverse in feel. So things that have basically, there are different things going on the surface. So soft, ridged, raised, or edged surfaces. Also things that change over time. So some examples of that might be certain kinds of certain kinds of interfaces are projected. So like the Sony Xperia Touch, you get this thing where you're projecting onto a surface, and then that basically means that you could have massively kind of diverse experiences of interface manipulation because it's on a surface, which could be any kind of surface. Similarly, this is the Lumi Watch. This works really similarly. And this is a kind of speculative example of a sort of skin, a kind of artificial skin on an interface, on a hardware, sort of on a device, which again, this is speculative rather than an actual product, but this would be an example of a really interesting kind of haptic experience, which is really textural. Another dimension of this kind of experience is elasticity. Sorry, I've gone too far. Elasticity, which is about touch experiences that are flexible, mutable, and organic. So this is about changing and how the experience changes. So for example, interfaces that respond to physical touch by changing shape or feel or temperature. Obviously, there isn't that much of this kind of thing. An example of this is materialable, which is a kind of interface that changes shape as you use it. Another dimension, the third dimension, is gesturality, which is the extent to which haptic experience breaks the link between direct contact and outcome. So what's meant by this is something that the more gestural something is, the less you have to actually make physical contact in order to get something to happen. So VR in certain contexts works like this. This is arguably sort of negatively correlated to the experience of touch richness, because obviously you're not touching at all. You're just sort of moving in different ways. But I think that it's more complex than that. And this is one of the ones that bears some more research for sure. And it's one of the most interesting ones as well for me. And this is an example of a gestural app that you don't actually have to touch the screen. And there are loads of these now, obviously. And then finally, interpolation. And this is the extent to which physical touch disrupts visual information flow. This one's probably the most complex, but this one is basically about, it's the opposite of the thing where you can do the constant uninterrupted scrolling and consumption of information. It actually is the quality that forces you out of that and it interrupts the information flow and has you use the haptic sense to sort of switch modes and start processing information through that sense instead of the visual verbal sense, which is what tends to be ongoing in other sort of contexts and is really standard. So an example of that is interfaces that borrow from sort of board game kind of design. I use Barrios because it's something designed for kids. Specifically, it requires the user to interact physically with objects in space in order to make the interface work. So you have to kind of stop processing in a really direct way in order to make the actual digital interface work, so you can then return to the visual verbal. And this would be sort of high interpolation because it forces you out of the visual verbal processing mode. Some other examples of this are feature phones that have sort of the raised buttons that you have to interact with, and suddenly you're feeling something and manipulating something. And this is No Phone, which is a speculative device that is pure touch and feel and no verbal visual information at all. So although there is a kind of obvious need for better interface design in terms of well-being, from a well-being perspective, there are obviously equally obvious sort of limitations, namely kind of technological and market constraints. This slide gives a quick overview of some of the key barriers and some of the key opportunities, and I'll just sort of let you look at that. In practical terms, developing new hardware design is likely to involve using existing materials differently and also sourcing new materials. So that's going to be really expensive. So things developing like shape changing and color changing polymers and smart fabrics and soft circuit technologies and graphene-based conductive elements and things like that. So obviously there's a cost associated with R&D. So coming from a speculative design kind of perspective, it's an interesting situation for designers in terms of speculative design, because we can make sort of concepts and prototypes that might never become commercial products, but they can help companies work through what would become design and production challenges and figure out where and how to invest in development. So it's a way of kind of playing through without, like, before you invest. Still, it seems that we've sort of learned in the last couple of decades in relation to climate change, for example, that firms that have been kind of better prepared for policy change around public health and these sorts of issues have been those that were already developing and testing approaches. So there's going to be an increasing level of risk in not attending to consumer well-being as part of sort of corporate responsibility. So there's a couple of big motivators for investing in this area. So just to close, our proposal really is that reorienting interface design towards more rich haptic experience and touch richness is a really promising approach for correcting some of the negative impacts of existing interface design standards for consumer well-being. And that's it. So thanks so much for the listen.
Very much, Danielle. We've got time for one quick question. Has anybody got a question?
Thank you very much for that paper. I think your research and opinions are very valuable. I've just got one question. Do you manage to get your work recognized by the manufacturers? Going back into the past, there was first disk computers came out. Ergonomically, they were very, very difficult to use. And it took quite a long time for those changes that were absolutely vital to be made. So there needs to be a real close link between the research you're doing and the people who need to react to that research. And I was just wondering whether you can see that communication pattern happening.
Yeah, so I think, thanks for that. That's a great question. And it's really kind of a central concern. It's a sort of pathway to this making a difference at all, right? So I totally agree with that. And so Yoshi is currently doing in fact, Yoshi, why don't I, if you're able to sort of come in on that question, Yoshi's research is specifically, will be engaging with people in those organizations in order to make that understood. But yeah, Yoshi, if you want to speak about that.
Yes. Thank you, Danielle, for the presentation and talking about our research. And yeah, great question, and thank you for asking that. So in my PhD, I'm not only proposing a touch-rich interaction design solution, but also thinking of ways how can I engage the large IT companies with such design. So I'm currently in that stage where I have created one of a kind of example of touch-rich interaction, and the next stage would be getting some feedback and also raising awareness with experts from large IT companies, and also hopefully there will be maybe several outcomes. Danielle suggests maybe writing a white paper and distributing that and raising awareness in that way. Also maybe pitching that kind of design to some of the large IT companies who would be interested in that kind of design and approach. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very quick question.
Sorry, I was just wondering if there's any sort of angle in your sort of research to do with neurodivergence, because increasingly people are looking at sound and visuals through the lens of having a very inclusive approach where people who are neurodivergent can engage. And I was wondering if that could apply to your haptic research as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the most interesting kind of future avenues of this from my point of view, because you're absolutely right. It's a fantastic question. And everything that we've found has confirmed that this is a kind of understudied application, let's say, or way of understanding application. So just really quickly, the kind of the cognitive load, it's about cognitive load and how that, how the ask on visual verbal faculties for the user. And so obviously, if you are, for certain forms of neurodivergence, you basically, that already is an issue. And so it becomes even more of an issue with kind of the scrolling news feed and this kind of thing. So applications of this, or kind of applications of this sort of design strategy, are likely to be even more relevant for neurodivergence, I would think. I mean, it's the kind of working hypothesis where, because rates of like addictive behaviors related to smartphones tend to be higher in those groups. So absolutely. Yeah. And I don't know if Yoshi, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, nothing to add from me.
No, I think we don't have any more time. It might be interesting for you to talk to, I think it was Natasha Trotman, who was our key speaker earlier in the week, who was works at the Wellcome Trust and does work on neurodiversity. So she might be someone who might be worth just getting in touch with. But anyway, thank you very much. It's very interesting to think about how interfaces are going to be developing in the future. So now I'd like to call on Helena and Vera and